So in this video, we're going to compare the M1 Max and the M1 Pro against the original M1 chip. For these tests, I went ahead and created a 4K timeline with a total length of 9 minutes. The clips edited within this video were all filmed at 4K and cover a range of codecs from H.264 to H.265. Furthermore, to make this test more challenging across all of the M1 machines, there is a deflicker effect applied to every single clip, along with noise reduction and heavy color grading. The main focus of this test is to see how much quicker each M1 chip is, but also monitor the total fan noise. Because judging from my last video, many people don't seem to appreciate how important a quiet machine is for people that work with a lot of audio. I know myself from being a musician that Apple computers are fantastic at running at very low volumes. The last thing you need is a computer blaring away in the background that will either bleed into your recordings or affect your accuracy while you work. So I went ahead and placed a very expensive Sennheiser microphone close to all of the computers so we can have a clean audio recording of the fan's performance. Additionally, I will also use a dB counter to monitor the actual volume the computer is outputting to prove I have not manipulated any of this audio in post. Let's take a look at the M1 Pro inside of a 16-inch MacBook. This is the model with a 16-core GPU and 16 GB of RAM. Here is a keyboard typing test to give you a base level of the audio volume. And we can now go ahead and begin the render. As you saw from that footage, we saw a high of around 28 dB for the M1 Pro, which in a real-world environment is virtually inaudible. While you're using the machine, you cannot hear the fans on this computer. The total render time for the M1 Pro was 28 minutes and 27 seconds, which I thought was very impressive for a timeline that is this demanding. Next, let's take a look at the M1 Max inside of the 14-inch MacBook Pro. This model has got a 32-core GPU combined with 32 GB of RAM. Here is the M1 Max typing test. And now let's begin the renders. Initially, the M1 Max began incredibly quiet, just like all of the other machines. But after just 4% progression into the timeline's render, the fans began to ramp up and went into the mid-30s on the dB counter. Around 50% into the render progression, this is where it started to get even worse. And we see the dB counter head into the mid-40s. And then soon after, progresses to a high of 55 dB and continues at this level until the end of the render. The M1 Max has a very impressive render time of 16 minutes and 12 seconds. And this performance really blew me away. But this huge performance comes at a major cost, and that is the fact the M1 Max is almost double the volume of the M1 Pro when it's under load. And maybe some of you don't care about that, but my concern is for the future, as this M1 MacBook is straight out of the box. There's no dust or anything inside of the fans, and when this laptop becomes 1, 2, 3 years old, I feel like you may encounter some form of heat problems, because clearly the M1 Max is huge compared to the M1 and M1 Pro. And already the 14-inch is on the brink of its heat capacity at cooling this processor. An extra comparison I want to show you is the original M1 chip with 16 GB of RAM. The results from this test was very interesting and shows you the major improvement with just the M1 Pro. With the M1 iMac, rendering out this timeline took 1 hour and 23 minutes and 36 seconds, which is almost 3 times longer than the M1 Pro. And I know in real everyday use, the M1 iMac is more than capable for rendering out videos quickly, especially if they're just YouTube videos, they render out in like 3-4 minutes. But in extreme scenarios that requires a lot of power from a GPU, I do think this test shows the value of upgrading to the M1 Pro a bit more clear. If you want to learn more about the M1 Pro 16-inch MacBook, I highly recommend checking out this video next.